Howdy, it's Kyle with a video talking about Virginia. In this video, I'll be talking about various aspects of the geography of the state. I'll be discussing the physical landscape to include the climate and the national parks. I'll also be talking about the economy of the state to go over the GDP, the companies that are headquartered there, the industries that drive the economy, taxes and agriculture, as well as some of the cultural aspects of the state to include music and food. So if you want to learn more about the Old Dominion state, this is the video for you. Virginia is right in the middle of all the coastal states along the Atlantic. You can call it the northern end of the South or the southern end of the North. The population of the state is about 8.6 million. It was right at 8 million at the 2010 census, so it's the 12th most populous state in the country, just behind New Jersey and Michigan, but it's growing faster than New Jersey, so by the 2030 census, Virginia will likely be the 11th most populous state in the country. It's one of the smaller states in the country in terms of size. It's 36 in the country in total area, just ahead of Kentucky and just behind Ohio. And even though it's a small state, it is third in the country in terms of number of counties. There are 133 counties in this small state, so the counties are very small. It's also the only state in the country that does this very strange thing where cities are not part of counties. There are 38 cities in the state that are not within a county. So say, for example, you live in the city of Roanoke. You do not live in Roanoke County. There are two separate entities. Everywhere else in the country, if you live within the city jurisdiction, you are also within a county. So say you live in Houston, you're also within Harris County, or if you live within the city of Phoenix, you're in Maricopa County. But in Virginia, if you live in a city, you are not in a county. They are completely separate jurisdictions. It's a very strange way of doing things, and for someone like me that keeps my own spreadsheets of geographic data, it makes things a little more complicated. I don't really get into history very much on this channel, but you can't really discuss Virginia without getting into some of the history. It was one of the original 13 colonies, and it was the 10th state to ratify the Constitution in 1788. And a lot of the things that we think about when we think about America, freedom and our constitutional rights, came from the minds of Virginians. And Virginia is the home state of the largest number of presidents, with 4 of the first 5 and 7 of the first 11 presidents all coming from Virginia. And of the 13 colonies, Virginia had the smallest percentage of the population that was living along the coast. The coastal area is pretty swampy and not really good for agriculture, and most of the Virginia population lived inland. The capital city is Richmond with a population of about 240,000, and the Richmond-Petersburg metropolitan area has about 1.3 million, which makes it the 50th largest metro in the U.S. It's growing at a decent pace. It was right about 1 million people at the 2010 census. And this century did quite a bit of improvements in the city. About 20 years ago or so, it was a pretty rough place. It was pretty nasty, but there has been some progress in recent years. A lot of it's been through gentrification, which has its positives and negatives, but it's hard to say that Richmond hasn't improved this century. A lot of the population and economic growth there is due to the fact that it's both a state capital and a college town, and that's certainly something that's been going on throughout the entire country. So places that have a large concentration of educated people, such as state capitals and college towns, have seen a lot of growth in recent years. The growth hasn't been as crazy as Raleigh, Nashville, or Austin, but it still has seen quite a bit of growth. But Richmond isn't the largest city in the state, and the Richmond area isn't the largest metro. The largest concentration of people in Virginia is in the northern part of the state. These are primarily DC suburbs, and there's been quite a bit of growth in recent years. Approximately half of the state's population lives north and east of Richmond, mostly in the DC suburbs. This is where you have the historic town of Alexandria, which is older than DC itself. And it's also home to Arlington, which is actually a county, not a city, so it's another one of those strange things about Virginia. But because there are height restrictions on the buildings in DC itself, there aren't any skyscrapers in Washington. So where you see the skyscrapers in the DC metro area are generally on the Virginia side, mostly in Arlington. Within the Northern Virginia area are the counties of Fairfax and Loudoun, and these are the 2 counties with the highest income in the entire country, which puts it in stark contrast with the southwestern portion of the state, which is one of the poorest parts of the country. The largest metro area wholly contained within the state is called the Hampton Roads area in the southeastern portion of the state. This includes the state's largest city, which is Virginia Beach, with about 450,000 people. It also includes Norfolk, Chesapeake, Portsmouth, Suffolk, Newport News, Hampton, as well as a few others. But because, again, Virginia is so weird, none of these are counties. They're all individual cities, and they add up to a population of about 1.6 million. It hasn't really grown much in recent years. It had about 1.6 million at the 2010 census. Virginia Beach itself is kind of a tourist destination, has a lot of high-rise hotels along the beach. It's kind of like a Myrtle Beach or a Galveston kind of place, but it isn't quite as tacky as those. After the Hampton Roads area, the DC suburbs, and Richmond, The largest population center is the Roanoke-Blacksburg area in the southwestern portion of the state. There are about 320,000 people or so in that metro area. Roanoke is into the foothills of the Appalachians, so there's a little bit of a different feel to this part of the state. But just like most other medium-sized cities in the Appalachian region, Roanoke has been growing and it's no longer kind of a hillbilly backwater like it used to be. A lot of the growth in that part of the state is in and around Blacksburg, which is the college town of Virginia Tech. And it's a really nerdy kind of engineering school, so a lot of high-tech stuff has been going up around there, some kind of research-oriented things that go along with the university. And there are a few other medium-sized towns in the state. You've got Lynchburg and Danville and the college towns of Charlottesville and Harrisonburg, but most of the rest of the state is pretty rural. So now I want to discuss some of the physical geography of the state. And even though it's a pretty small state, there are three distinct physiographic regions. The eastern third of the state is coastal lowlands, a lot of swampy areas and wetlands. The middle part of the state is the Piedmont with some rolling hills, and the western part of the state is up into the Appalachians. One of the defining features of the physical geography of Virginia is Chesapeake Bay. The importance of the bay in terms of navigation and port is well documented throughout U.S. history. Although the areas right along it were fairly lightly populated during the colonial years, and even today the areas right along the bay are fairly lightly populated, except for the areas right around the Norfolk, Virginia Beach area. And this area is where you had the Jamestown colony, and because it was really a swampy area that wasn't very good for much of anything, the colony failed. Like I mentioned before, Virginia was the colony that had the fewest number of people living along the coast, and that's because of this kind of swampy land that really wasn't good for much. In the southeastern corner of the state, right along the North Carolina border, is the Great Dismal Swamp, which is one of the greatest names for a natural area in the country. And this is a pretty cool place. You don't often associate Virginia with having swamps, but there is one right there. And it's also the northern extent of the natural range of the American alligator. So you don't find too many alligators in Virginia, but they are there. Just across the mouth of Chesapeake Bay from the large population center is the Delmarva Peninsula, and it gets its name because it includes portions of Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia. So the Virginia Eastern Shore is that little peninsula that sticks out from the southern end of the Delmarva Peninsula. And this is a very lightly populated area. It's very flat and kind of featureless, but it is kind of cool with some very nice beaches. And if you've ever driven across the Chesapeake Bay Bridge, it's kind of creepy because you're on a bridge and all of a sudden you're going under the water into a tunnel. It's pretty weird. I'm not really sure why they did that and didn't just do the bridge high enough so the boats could pass under it, but there's a tunnel underneath it, which makes it much more difficult to widen or improve, which they're trying to do right now, but it is there. It's a pretty cool drive. And even though it's a coastal state, it doesn't really have a lot of great beaches. Virginia Beach, again, is pretty popular, and the Eastern Shore area on the Delmarva Peninsula has some pretty nice beaches, but again, with the Chesapeake Bay being so swampy, there aren't really good beaches around there. But like many other states along the Atlantic coast, there are plenty of barrier islands off the coast that are unpopulated. Some of these are protected, and it's also the southern end of the Assateague Island area, which is where you have the famous wild horses. The middle of the state, which is the Piedmont, you gotta have some rolling hills there. This is historically where you had the largest population center. This is where Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and James Monroe all had their big plantations. Jefferson founded the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, and it's also the part of the state where you have the capital, Richmond. As you move west, you get to the state's only national park for nature, that being Shenandoah. The topography and scenery there is pretty similar to Great Smoky Mountains, but the park itself isn't as extensive. It's basically just one long drive called Skyline Drive, and some areas just off the road there. So it isn't a huge national park, but it is pretty beautiful. In the far southwestern corner of the state is where you have the state's highest point, Mount Rogers, which is right about 5,700 feet. In the eastern U.S., only New Hampshire, North Carolina, and Tennessee have peaks higher than Mount Rogers. Based on its location, its climate is pretty middle of the road in most aspects. It has pretty hot, humid summers, but not as bad as the southeast, has pretty cold, snowy winters, but not as bad as the northeast, has a lot of thunderstorms, but as many as the Midwest, and it does get an occasional hurricane and tropical storm, but not as many as you get down south. Next, I want to talk about some of the economic aspects of the state. So I'll be going over the major industries, companies that are headquartered there, agriculture, and taxes. So in other words, show me the money. The state has a GDP of $560 billion, which makes it the 13th highest GDP in the country. Its GDP per capita is $52,000 per year, which is 18th highest in the country. And its median household income is $73,000 a year, which is 11th in the country. So overall, it's in the top third in terms of wealthy states. But like I mentioned before, the southwestern corner of the state is very poor. It's one of the poorest parts of the country, which is pretty similar to the rest of rural Appalachia. By far, the most important aspect of Virginia's economy is the federal government. And a lot of folks might look down upon a state like Virginia because it is so heavily dependent on the man, because, we all hate the government. But with a country of 330 million people, we're going to have a large government. And with Virginia being one of the two states that borders D.C., of course, there's going to be a lot of government jobs within the state. It's hard to put an exact number on the percentage of the state's economy that is based upon the government, because a lot of folks work for the government itself, but a lot of folks work for government contractors, which are private companies, but they wouldn't be in operation without receiving government funding. But a rough estimate would be about 25% of all jobs in the state are either with the government or with government contractors. Another way of looking at it is that 12% of all federal tax dollars go to Virginia. And under the government umbrella, the military is the largest part of that funding. The Department of Defense headquarters, the Pentagon, is right there in Arlington, as well as many other major military installations. Norfolk is mostly known for having a large naval presence, with the naval base there being the largest in the country. It's also where you have the Oceana Naval Air Station, and nearby in Yorktown is where you have the Naval Weapons Station. There's also a large Army presence there, with both Fort A.P. Hill and Fort Eustis in the state. And you also have a large NASA and Air Force presence there with the Langley Research Center. So with the Pentagon itself being there, as well as the largest naval base in the country and many other major military bases, Virginia is by far the most important state in the country in terms of our military. But the federal government's role in Virginia isn't limited to the military. It's also the home of the Central Intelligence Agency, or the CIA. And it's also home to my personal favorite part of the federal government, and that's the U.S. Geological Survey, the USGS. In terms of major government contractors, it's home to Northrop Grumman, which is a large producer of jets and other military weapons. It's also home to General Dynamics, which is another part of the military-industrial complex. And Virginia is also the headquarters of the Navy Federal Credit Union. But it isn't just about the man in Virginia. There are plenty of companies that are headquartered in the state that aren't associated with the federal government. Some of the major companies that are headquartered in Virginia include Dollar Tree Stores, Hilton Hotels, Brinks Security, Bechtel, Smithfield Pork, Capital One Bank and Financial, United Way, Mars Food Corporation, and Touchstone Energy. So that's a pretty good list of companies that are headquartered in the state. In terms of agriculture, Virginia is not one of the most important states in the country. It ranks 31st overall in terms of ag. Historically, tobacco was the most important crop for the state, but tobacco industry has decreased significantly in recent years, although it still is the fourth largest tobacco producing state in the country. It's sixth in the country in terms of the number of turkey farms. It's also sixth in the country in terms of apples, but most of the apples are grown in just the top few states, so by the time you get down to number 6, it really isn't that many. So overall, Virginia isn't a terribly important state in terms of ag. But where Virginia more than makes up for it is in terms of aquaculture, which is basically seafood production. It's fourth in the entire country in terms of aquaculture, so it has a lot more seafood production than most other states that have a much larger coastline. It's the number 1 state in the country for production of oysters. It's also the number 1 state in terms of clam production. Although just like pretty much anywhere else in the world that is reliant on seafood, it's been a lot of decrease in recent years due to overfishing. So the future of Virginia's aquaculture might very well be in terms of farming, but it still continues to be one of the most important states in terms of seafood production. And now to talk about everyone's favorite topic, that being taxes. Virginia has a 5.75% state income tax, which is below average. It has a 5.6% sales tax, which is the 41st in the country, has a 0.8% property tax, which is 37th in the country, and has a 22 cents per gallon gas tax, which is 38th in the country. So it has below average income tax, the 10th lowest sales tax, 14th lowest property tax, and 13th lowest gas tax. So overall, Virginia is a pretty low tax state. So now I want to talk about some of the people and cultural aspects of the state. The primary indigenous groups in the state include the Powhatan in the coastal areas, the Monacan in the Piedmont central part of the state, and the Cherokee in the southwestern corner of the state. The Powhatan being in the coastal area were the ones that the Spanish and English explorers first made contact with. The Powhatan were the ones that helped out the English settlers get started in the first place, helping them out at Jamestown and other settlements, but of course once the English brought more people over to North America, many of the Powhatan were killed off. But because the English were the first Europeans to settle there, you have many folks that were of English descent living in Virginia. So now I want to talk about some of the signature foods of the state. And one of the first things you might think of when you think of Virginia is Virginia ham. Virginia ham is a type of ham, not just ham that comes from Virginia. You can have Virginia ham from Arkansas, or you can have a non-Virginia ham from Virginia. It's known for being a cured, really salty ham. So if you like salty cured meats, this stuff is pretty good. When most folks think of blue crab and crab cakes, they're probably going to think of Maryland first, but Chesapeake Bay goes right through Virginia as well. So Virginia is pretty well known for its crab cakes as well. But other than that, there really aren't that many signature foods from Virginia. They are well known for their cherry pie and turkey casserole, but neither of those originated from Virginia. But they're both pretty good. For the next topic, I usually make a little bit of a mention of the pro sports teams in the state, but interestingly enough, Virginia is the most populous state in the country that doesn't have any pro sports teams. Of course, with Washington right there, you have all 5 major sports teams playing there, but none of them actually play in Virginia. And now I wanted to mention some of the prominent musical acts that come from Virginia. In terms of pop music, Virginia is home to Bruce Hornsby, Dave Matthews Band, Chris Brown, Dave Grohl, Jason Mraz, and Missy Elliott Misdemeanor. It's also the home of Ruth Brown, the queen of R&B. There have been a pretty decent number of major country music artists come from the state, including June Carter Cash, Roy Clark, Patsy Cline, Juice Newton, Ricky Van Shelton, and Phil Vassar, as well as a couple of the greatest bluegrass pickers of all time, Ralph Stanley and Tony Rice. And it's also home to the self-proclaimed worst rock band of all time, GWAR. Technically, GWAR is from outer space, but yeah, they're from Virginia. So that's an okay list of musical acts that call Virginia home. So those are some of the things I wanted to discuss about Virginia. It's a very important state due to so many federal government assets being located there, but it isn't all about the federal government. There's a pretty diversified economy going on in the state as well. So it's a pretty popular state in terms of people moving to, and it's not just the DC suburbs. There's also quite a bit of growth in the Richmond-Petersburg area. You have reasonably low cost of living, although like everywhere else in the U.S., it's going up, and you have fairly low taxes there. You have pretty mild climate, so it's a pretty attractive state for a lot of people. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give me a thumbs up to let me know you approve, and consider subscribing to this channel if you're interested in hearing more about U.S. geography, general travel kind of stuff, road tripping across the U.S., and just everything from a nerdy perspective. But yeah, thanks for watching. Geography King, signing out.